Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, today I want to discuss with you a very, very important topic. And the topic is Lashon Ha'ra. But predominantly how it's understood nowadays in the Jewish world, which is almost solely through the Chafetz Chaim's work, where he actually gets his name from. And his second work, known as Shmirat HaLashon, which today are actually sold in many bookstores in one book, almost like an anti-Lashon Ha'ra Bible. Again, made up of his first book, which is known as the Chafetz Chaim. He gets that from Tehillim 34, and his other famous book known as Shmirat HaLashon. Actually, the Chafetz Chaim's real name was Rabbi Asher Meza. Now, first, I want to discuss with you what is generally known or understood as Lashon Ha'ra in the Jewish world today. In other words, what has been accepted as a standard of speech in mainstream Torah life. And friends, honestly, you will find that virtually no other issue is so stressed in the Jewish world like the issue of Lashon Ha'ra. It is so stressed that there are even been categories or levels of speech that have been created to check and double check that Lashon Ha'ra is never spoken. Now friends, I am in no way saying that Lashon Ha'ra is not a real issue, because of course it is, and I'm not in any way trying to say anything negative about the Chafetz Chaim, because honestly, he was a great Talmud Chacham. And I'm sure no one in the Jewish world denies that. No, friends, I'm just trying to report how his works have affected society and how his works should be viewed from a halachic and Judaic perspective. Now, you're probably thinking, at least from a basic perspective, how can Rabbi Asher fill a whole lecture just on the topic of Lashon Ha'ra? Now, those familiar with all these supposed halachot regarding Lashon Ha'ra would find that statement unlikely. Mainly because what is known today as Lashon Ha'ra has the potential to have hundreds of hours spoken about it, which it already has, not to mention countless of sforim already written on the topic. And honestly, friends, so much time and money has been invested in defeating this real issue, pretty much all based on the works of the Chafetz Chaim. So much invested. And the truth, friends, is that they have not even scratched the surface to be able to understand or explain what has come to be known as Hilchot Lashon Ha'ra. And friends, my goal here is to find out why. And friends, the truth is that there is no sugya for Lashon Ha'ra, at least amongst Chazal. In other words, we can honestly say that the Chafetz Chaim actually created the supposed halachot that exist today regarding Lashon Ha'ra by the release of his two works. Now, I'm not saying that the concept did not exist by Chazal, but rather that it only appeared among Chazal as Divrei Musar and never in terms of halakha. Saying what? Well, saying that we do not know for certain anything authoritative on the topic outside what appears in Torah Shebiktav, outside what appears in the written law, which goes for anything outside of practical halakha. And I would actually go as far as to say that the Chafetz Chaim's work against Lashon Ha'ra actually hurt the Jewish world more than it ever helped it, basically by codifying virtually every opinion held by a Rishon on the topic, not to mention every Midrash and Agadah found in Shas on the issue as what? Not as possible good or bad advice, but as binding dogma. In other words, eliminating the need for ethical common sense to be applied in an area that was never meant to be understood in a dogmatic fashion. Ultimately creating loopholes that did not previously exist that can and are exploited by evil individuals who hide behind halakha, or in this case, supposed halakha. As a matter of fact, like we said today, you have whole countless shiurim and sforim based on expounding the works of the Chafetz Chaim without first asking if any of this is theologically binding. In other words, is it true, infallible, or is it just opinion? And if it's just opinion, what could possibly be the ramifications of taking something that is just opinion from the standpoint that it is now divinely inspired, absolute, and infallible? And friends, one of the main motivators for this lecture are the countless individuals who have been made to suffer because of what has become known as Hilchot Lashon Ha'ra. In other words, the countless crimes that have either been covered up or not even reported under the guise of Lashon Ha'ra. So friends, what is Lashon Ha'ra? Or literally, rechilut, gossip or slander? Actually, friends, the whole basis against speaking Lashon Ha'ra comes from one pasuk in Vayikra. It states, do not go around spreading slander among your people. But friends, what many fail to realize when quoting this pasuk as the sole reason for the prohibition is the second half of the pasuk, which immediately reads, "Neither shall you stand against the blood of your neighbor." Or, in other words, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. In other words, friends, without first understanding the second half, you cannot possibly begin to understand the first. Now, the problem is that many modern rabbis have worked hard to prohibit Lashon Ha'ra, but rather, by always in an attempt to piously outdo each other, they have gone as far as to limit virtually all speech, with an obvious clear emphasis on an ascetic, reclusive limit on speech rather than an attempt to actively help those in need. And regardless, this is all that is known as the actual makor for Lashon Ha'ra. In other words, it's only that pasuk in Vayikra. That's all we have. That's all that actually exists. Now, there are other portions that emphasize the prohibition, but this is the actual makor, the actual source for the Avirah. Now, there's certainly no harm, at least from an academic perspective, having teachers expound on what this pasuk could possibly include. Again, without delving into the error of even giving the hint that anything else on the subject that exists is authoritative and not just opinion. And in turn, also teach that when confronted in any situation of the like, one should always use their own good judgment and not fall into the rut of dogma in a non-halachic situation that the Torah does not give specifics on. And friends, what is the difference between halakha and opinion anyways? Which I think is the greatest confusion most religious Jews suffer from today. Friends, our sages, the great court, only were given authority to legislate on practical matters, what is known as halakha lemaseh, and not ethics. Now, we know that much has been written by our sages on ethics. Great works like Pirkei Avot is one example. Again, all of this written in the realm of opinion and things that were never meant to be understood as legally binding or theologically dogmatic. Why? Because, friends, the ethical only derives from the divine. And on that, no one can improve. The divine what? The only divine message we ever received from the Almighty, which is Torah on Har Sinai. And the same goes for the mystical. And my friends, this is a basic Judaic principle you need to understand before being able to properly understand Jewish law and hashkafa and outlook and philosophy. For example, in terms of the mystical, only because the court, let's say, would declare that Mashiach would arrive on Monday does not mean that it would actually occur. And in terms of the ethical, only because the court would rule something unethical, which may have been previously understood as ethical, does not in any way establish a new ethical paradigm. No, friends, rabbinic statements on either the ethical or the mystical, from at least an authoritative perspective, could never be binding outside what already appears in Torah Shebiktav, outside of the written law. Why not? Because then you could actually have an outside body rearranging the Torah's framework without the Almighty's consent. In other words, within Torah, the only areas that cannot be modified or reinterpreted by a court to fit society is what is ethical and what is mystical. And why was the court only regulated to practical law, to halakha? Easy, because practical law in terms of application needs to be universally interpreted and adjusted to fit a given society situation, while ethics needs to personally be adjusted to fit an individual situation. And this is also clearly seen, my friends, in the example given in Parashat Shoftim and other places on the cases that the court would actually be responsible for adjudicating. In other words, only practical law to get Israel functioning in a unified manner. Practical law that, if interpreted wrong, would not hold any theological ramifications with what appears in the written law. And this is, my friend, what we actually see happening in Shas in terms of Lashon Ha'ra. Rabbis giving their ultimately conflicting opinions on how the prohibition of rechilut should apply. But again, this was always only done as a form of musar and never to be confused with binding halakha. Because remember, friends, the only thing that can classify and codify ethics from an authoritative perspective is Torah, and any attempt to improve on what the Torah has laid down will fail. In other words, the words of Lo Tasur does not include hashkafa or issues dealing with musar. Now, I know that from the outset you were probably wondering, what is Rabbi Asher going to teach us that the Torah already does not teach us against gossiping or slander, what is known as rechilut? In other words, what else could be said? Well, friends, if you tune into any Lashon Ha'ra shiur, they would basically expound on the codifications made throughout the years of what to say or what not to say or when to say it, basically in any given situation. And like we said, it's really this act that has not only caused many crimes in the Jewish world to go unpunished or even unreported, but actually has us choosing not to say anything about any given situation in order not to violate some supposed later unfounded opinion that became halakha. Now, friends, anyways, before delving further, you must know that the term Lashon Ha'ra does not appear in Tanakh, okay? And apart from the glimpses to the prohibition, like we see Miriam wronging Moshe Rabbeinu with her speech, like we said earlier, the actual Averah, the actual sin, is only found in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 16, of not gossiping amongst your people. But regardless, virtually all the examples of what is considered Lashon Ha'ra stem predominantly from Shas. Almost all of them. But what I'm sure you would be surprised to know is that Talmud Bavli never really clarified or classified what is Lashon Ha'ra. In other words, it used rechilut and Lashon Ha'ra interchangeably for similar offenses. So it seems that the whole notion of what classifies as Lashon Ha'ra today really only stems from the Rishonim onward, primarily the Rambam. Now, the Chafetz Chaim himself lists 31 instances in Torah Shebiktav that he attributes to be prohibitions against Lashon Ha'ra. But in all honesty, from the two examples we just mentioned earlier, no other mitzvah listed by the Chafetz Chaim really specifically has anything to do with Lashon Ha'ra. But regardless, he uses this and many other examples found in Shas and other rabbinic sources to establish a basis for his thesis. Okay, so what is Lashon Ha'ra from a rabbinical Judaic perspective? Because again, friends, I am in no way saying that a simple attempt should not be made to at least define the idea or the sin from a categorical perspective. And friends, for this I will use the Mishneh Torah in Hilchot Deot, in the 7th parach. Again, because it is primarily the Rambam who lays down the framework for everything that exists in the Jewish world today on the issue. So, we see that the Rambam here more explaining the mitzvah regarding rechilut rather than an attempt to create a new halachic paradigm on the issue. And the Rambam pretty much classifies all types of possible violations of this Averah as rechilut. Because again, the Averah, the sin, is gossip, is rechilut. In other words, what is known as Lashon Ha'ra, although it sounds like it encompasses every form of evil speech, really only, from at least the perspective of the Rambam, really only encompasses what is spoken maliciously and is true. Again, an idea not defined by Chazal. So, the first form is non-malicious factual slander. In other words, something that is true, but the attempt to spread it is done not in order to harm someone else. Now, this seems to be classified as plain rechilut, or gossip. The second is actual Lashon Ha'ra, factual things that are spoken of with a malicious intent. And the third is when lies are being spoken about a person, and this is called Motzeh Shem Ra. And the fourth is Avak Lashon Ha'ra, which is literally the dust of evil speech. In other words, speech that either alludes to or encourages Lashon Ha'ra. So, this is the basis of what is known as rechilut, or what is plainly called Lashon Ha'ra nowadays, at least from a post-10th century perspective. And it's really this foundation that the Chafetz Chaim used in his codification of the topic. In other words, all these categories have a basis in some ethical narrative found in Torah. However, as we know, the Torah did not attempt to add anything more to the Averah of rechilut than what it already said in that pasuk in Vayikra. Okay? With me so far? Now, apart from the well-intentioned utopian attempts to filter all speech that we find by the Chafetz Chaim, what specifically within his codification actually gets misused and causes problems within the Jewish world, not to mention the world in general? Well, friends, first and foremost, one of the first principles we must learn when deciding to either speak or not speak Lashon Ha'ra, if it's for the purpose of toilet, if it's for a constructive purpose. Now, this is where the Chafetz Chaim failed profusely. Not that he did not believe in the principle of toelet or toelah in terms of speaking Lashon Ha'ra, but rather that he placed so many prerequisites for toelah that it makes it very difficult to warn someone else of danger. In other words, he did for toilet the same he did for Lashon Ha'ra in general. In other words, he made an attempt to eliminate both. Why? Because he knew that under the guise of le toilet, anyone could virtually justify any form of speech, which is another example why these laws were not meant to be halachic or ever codified. For example, the Chafetz Chaim rules that if one's intent for toilet is tinged with any animosity, it is forbidden. However, friends, we know that when a person has been victimized by another, either physically, emotionally, financially, or sexually, feelings of anger and resentment and even revenge and hatred are normal. So responding to such a personal violation must be allowed, no matter what some later rabbi may have said or what that person may feel. Also, in terms of rumors, he rules that permission to act on rumors is granted only when there is a presumed certainty that the rumors are factual, and when the responder is motivated by both a need to prevent the desecration of God's name and to protect others from harm. He then explains that he would only allow the acceptance of rumors if they were only about a number of sins that the subject commits, and not just one, but a number of them, my friend. Even if it was recurring, and that person must also be violating those sins presently, not just in the past. And the funny thing is that many other Rishonim and Achronim actually disagree with the Chafetz Chaim's conclusions, many of his conclusions. So this is ultimately has become the standard of the Chafetz Chaim, what he actually poskened into existence, which again is not what is done with issues regarding Musar. Friends, are you beginning to see the problem here? And one quick tidbit regarding the prohibition against Lashon Ha'ra is the fact that according to Chazal, and reiterated by the Rambam, that if something is already known by at least 3 people, repeating it would not be Lashon Ha'ra, which is an idea almost completely ignored by the Chafetz Chaim, almost completely limiting public information, whether it's news or history. No, friends, in this area, the Chafetz Chaim chose to posken outside of Chazal, maintaining that in this area, only a statement that can be interpreted 2 ways, either positively or negatively, may be repeated. Again, there is no Torah or Mishnaic source for this answer. But does anyone question? No, of course not. Why? Because nowadays, even assuming that a rabbi may be wrong, or at least saying it publicly, would be considered Lashon Ha'ra. And friends, another area is regarding who you are supposedly allowed to speak Lashon Ha'ra about. Now, clearly everyone knows that pagans are not included in Amitecha, in your people. But friends, that in no way gives us the green light to bash all non-Jews and at the same time protect all ethnic Jews. And this is another problem that occurs when trying to codify an issue with a mindset that is different than the mindset that was present when the original source material was first written. For example, anyone familiar with the life and works of the Chafetz Chaim knows that he was a great anti-Zionist and a great anti-communist. 2 titles that, might I add, at the time was held predominantly by Jews. 2 groups he clearly allowed not just Lashon Ha'ra to be spoken about, but in some cases, real physical action. And friends, the reason I'm mentioning this is because many today, as an excuse to bash others, typically always use the excuse that the individual is a Rasha or a non-Jew, so it doesn't count. When even according to the Rambam, any vile speech on any decent person, whether Jew or non-Jew, is prohibited mainly because of how it affects the speaker. And the Gemara here even extends Amitecha to also include someone who acts like your people. In other words, someone who acts decently. And what makes this problem greater now is that after so many extra new prohibitions have been created or supposedly clarified to protect the Jew in this area, now suddenly all these potential live rounds are shot at non-Jews. And friends, I must also note that this supposed allowance of Lashon Ha'ra on Gentiles and heretics really, according to many opinions, is not limited to Lashon Ha'ra, but rechilut in general. In other words, blatantly lying about someone. It's ridiculous. Now, this, friends, is really ethically unsubstantiated topic in Torah, and really, again, is only built on the simple idiotic notion that the initial Isur worded only includes Amitecha, in other words, as interpreted today to mean only ethnic Jews. So in terms of being able to speak Lashon Ha'ra on a heretic, what happens nowadays is that only because someone happens to disagree with your form of Judaism, it has many people classifying everyone as heretics and thus speaking Lashon Ha'ra or Hachalut on them, when that person has never really broken any of the Isurim that halachically classify someone as a heretic. And friends, if you really think about it, one of the main reasons these supposed laws of Lashon Ha'ra have been grossly ineffective at ending Rechilut is because virtually anyone can either use Toelet or calling the person being spoken about a Russia, or worse, putting their actual Jewishness into question so that, in their opinion, no prohibition of Rechilut would exist anymore. In other words, the new supposed laws against Lashon Ha'ra get used as a tool to abuse the innocent with. And friends, the purpose of this video is mainly to open up your ethical consciousness, because, friends, you have one. And friends, everything I'm telling you here is within the parameters of Torah and Halakha. And remember that the only thing that could codify ethics, and in this case, possible ethical speech, is only Torah Shebiktav, is only the written law that we received on Har Sinai. Because Halakha does not and should not teach you how to think, but rather only what to do. In other words, friends, no matter how much we try to run away from it, common sense plays a huge role in our theological consciousness, especially in ethical areas which the Torah is silent on. So ultimately, like we said, the utopian attempt made by not only the Chafetz Chaim, but many others to eliminate Lashon Ha'ra has only worsened the problem, like a rabbi once said, that no one knows the supposed halachot of Lashon Ha'ra better than the child molester. So friends, ultimately, the halachicization of Lashon Ha'ra is not only recent, but has had a negative effect on not just the Jewish world, but the world in general. To the point that even the former Rosh Hashiva of Babel once said publicly that the Chafetz Chaim, if he would have known how much innocent blood would have been spilled in the name of Lashon Ha'ra, he would never have written his book. And friends, as Torah true Jews, we must diligently work hard to restore our standards of speech back to the ethical imperative it once was, and use our common sense and conscience to decide what speech is appropriate within the parameters that have been laid down for us in Torah. And friends, if you're hearing me today and you're interested in learning more about Torah Judaism, please visit TorahJudaism.org. Thank you.